back on chapters of the COVID-19 country report, the second edition. We had a few weeks ago chapter 2, which was on the legal response, the governance and leadership and institutional arrangements, and as well as the legal responses to COVID-19. So this week we are looking at chapter 7, as we call it, of the second edition COVID-19 country report. And we have the International Cooperation and Trade team with us. The convener of this team is Professor Susie Graham. She is at the Department of Politics and International Relations at UJ. Her team consists of Professor Victoria Graham, who will co-present today, also from the Department of Political Science, but at the University of Pretoria. Then they will also introduce their two other colleagues that assisted them in producing the chapter. From both those colleagues are from UJ. Just a bit of background on this process. As you might or might not know, we published the first edition report last year, and ever since we've been working on the second edition report. Very similar chapters. We lost some chapters that were not so crucial in the second and third year of the pandemic, things like infrastructure and agriculture. We do not have those chapters anymore, but we added more chapters to the report. We're looking at, as an example, at the role of academia and research institutions during COVID. How did universities handle it? What was the contribution of the research institutions? We also added a chapter on human settlements that we didn't realize was such a big separate issue to just vulnerable groups that we had in the first edition. So what we are in the process at the moment is that most of the chapters are ready for publishing the second edition. Almost all of them are going to language editing and peer review at the moment. And I think we must also thank the peer reviewers of this specific chapter, Professor Albert Skuman from the University of the Free State, and Ms. Salome Baloyi Mbola from, she is acting COO of DIRCO. So we want to thank those people for very thorough peer review of this particular chapter. I must add that in the first edition and again in the second edition, this chapter to me was fascinating. I did not know before that establishing and maintaining international relations is so crucial, and you do not know how you will need that in the time of crisis. And South Africa seems to have done a very, very good job. So the interesting part of the second edition is, of course, the Omicron disaster that happened. And this chapter unpacks that for us in detail. So you'll see me when we have a discussion, but I'm now going to hand over to Susie. Is it you or Victoria that will start?
I'll start. Thanks so much, Marie.
Thank you.
And then I think, do I also need to turn my video off to help with bandwidth? So you just hear my voice, or is it okay to keep my video on?
It looks okay at the moment. So
okay, let me keep it on for as long as it's stable. Yeah. All right, so thanks so much, everybody. Thank you so much to Marie and to Anita for helping to facilitate this for us to be able to present today. And for those lovely introductions, Marie, thank you. Wonderful people to work with over this whole series. So thank you so much for that. I think the two colleagues that were going to be with us today to present are unfortunately not able to join us. So let me just in their absence refer to Mr. Mantsha Segololo, who is an outstanding emerging scholar in the Department of Politics at UJ, a doctoral candidate who wrote a section on trade and South Africa's economic engagement, and also Dr. Marcel Naga, as you see, the senior postdoc research fellow at the University of Johannesburg. Colleagues, I'm very happy to share space with here. So if we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Vicky. I'll go over what the outline of today's talk will be about, and that is really to reflect on how we structured our chapter based on the expertise of the four people involved. So we created a new section that wasn't there previously in the first edition, and that was in relation to the importance of international cooperation. And I think we did that because, as Marie was just saying, it became increasingly more evident just how important international cooperation was for South Africa especially, but really for all states involved in year 2 of the COVID pandemic, and just how invested countries need to be to support each other and what that cooperation actually means in times of real crisis, that is global crisis. Secondly, we looked at Omicron and the politics of COVID variants. Thirdly, we looked at vaccine diplomacy and South Africa's advocacy role in that respect. Fourthly, we engaged with South Africa's global economic initiatives and engagements during the period. And then we ended off with lessons learned and possible recommendations. Thanks very much, Vicky. Can we move on? So basically, what we decided to do at the start of this chapter was to really ascertain the status of South Africa's international cooperation efforts and trade statistics since March 2021 in response to the continued presence of the virus at the time. And as outlined by the previous edition of this chapter in the first round, the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic on global trade and international relations was unprecedented. I think we can all agree on that. But despite this, South Africa's response to the virus in the first year was lauded by some, especially global observers really invested and interested in what they were looking at. South Africa was considered to be a standout region. Sorry, colleagues, my electricity's just come back on at work, and so my printer's making noise. I hope you can still hear me. But South Africa was really lauded as a standout in the region, and especially emphasizing President Ramaphosa's frank and effective communication with his public and his government's move to close borders and restrict movement early on in the outbreak. Moreover, you'll recall as chair of the AU in 2020, President Ramaphosa used that platform to lobby international financial institutions for economic relief and concrete support for the continent. And aside from establishing a solidarity fund, used diplomatic outreach to assist in coordinating an African response. And I think that's the thing we want to really emphasize, just how important diplomatic outreach is in responding to a crisis such as this. And I think that we can all, as interested members in relation to government, etc., realize that there's an imminent crisis, one that's already unfolding between South Africa and America and Russia, etc., over Ukraine. So it's just so important to have international cooperation, and diplomacy is number one in that. So other initiatives initially spearheaded by the South African government and its partners were very successful in bringing global attention and solidarity to certain pandemic-related issues. And so, for example, some successful measures related to Ms. Lindiwe Zulu, Minister of Social Development in 2020, and Mr. Peter Eriksson, Minister for International Development Corporation of Sweden, led a joint global press release in the context of the UN, signed by close to 80 other countries, on protecting sexual and reproductive health and rights and promoting gender responsiveness in the COVID-19 crisis. And this was a very important and different type of effort to bring these vital social issues back in focus during the pandemic response. And it also found much better traction in Africa than is usually the case with sexual reproductive health and rights. Following this, the Minister of Social Development led a number of bi- and multilateral engagements on the same theme with their counterparts from several African countries. So these efforts by South Africa can't be underestimated. And after the initial year of coming to terms with what this outbreak might mean for South African citizens, for trade, for business and communities, as well as anticipating long-term impact, scientists, policymakers, governments, international organizations, and non-state actors around the world were able to identify the necessary steps to overcome related challenges where possible and mitigate others with short-term responses and immediate solutions. Bearing that in mind, so we obviously know that even though the World Health Organization has now said that the pandemic is no longer a pandemic, we realize that there are other anticipated or unanticipated pandemics that might follow. And therefore, South Africa can learn a great deal from its initial response to this global pandemic and its leadership role that it played during the time, and maybe where it could improve going forward. So methodologically, just to explain to colleagues, we did essentially a desktop review of literature and data obtained from primary and secondary sources, but we also included responses from interviews conducted by authors of our chapter, the 4 of us, as well as relevant information obtained through interviews conducted by other authors that we were invited to for other chapters in this edition. And so we were very, very grateful. I want to extend my thanks to them as well for including us in those interview sessions. So the key questions that we were seeking out, there were 2. To what extent has South Africa contributed in year 2 of the COVID pandemic, that is 2021, to the continued global response, and what factors have hindered this contribution, if any? And secondly, we looked at, has South Africa been able to learn from the initial year of the pandemic, and as such been able to leverage its international cooperative efforts and responses more effectively, or not? So basically, those are the 2 questions that covered us. And as I outlined in the initial, or the second slide, we looked at those 4 areas. Why is international cooperation important? What did the discovery of the Omicron variant do for South Africa? What does it mean to have a kind of vaccine diplomacy to overcome what President Ramaphosa called health apartheid, as well as South Africa's global economic engagements, and then we ended off with recommendations. So I think the first thing I can respond to is the importance of international cooperation for states. So many of us in the room understand this, but for those who don't quite understand it, I think that it's very important to look at several reasons, including being able to address global challenges in the first place. And that speaks directly to the global pandemic that we were all experiencing. That really came as a surprise to so many states. So many states had to really strategize overnight to try and resolve the growing crisis as they faced it, and then having to deal with multiple problems at the same time, including not just border issues, but national problems in relation to policing efforts, etc. So it's about cooperating for a purpose, and that is to assist each other as states in addressing global challenges, to promote economic growth, and another reason why states cooperate with each other, to build diplomatic relations, responding to other types of humanitarian crises, not solely pandemics, but maybe food security and climate change problems related to that, as well as other human security issues, and ensure effective international law and governance, a final reason why states choose to cooperate with each other. And one of the main reasons behind this methodologically and theoretically is so that states can build trust and understanding between each other. And the reason why they do that is to reduce conflict and increase cooperation in other areas. So there's a kind of balancing act that goes on between states in order to try and accommodate the best possible types of relationships and benefits from international relations. It's also to try and offset those very particular challenges that some states might face, where they need high-profile, high-powered partners and allies to try and assist them in reducing risk and addressing challenges. And it's also about regulating global trade, addressing environmental challenges, protecting human rights, as well as preventing other types of human conflicts. And international cooperation helps us to ensure that frameworks are in place for us to leverage responses adequately and timeously if there's a challenge that emerges. So one way for states to cooperate with each other internationally is through multilateral platforms and through global bodies. That's why South Africa, since 1994, since it became a democracy, invested so much time publicly in informing the world that it invested and felt that a great deal of emphasis should be placed on multilateralism, and the United Nations especially, and its bodies that are related to it, as an important avenue for debate, as an important avenue to facilitate the power politics that are at play on a daily basis, and really for states to have a voice. So it is about multilateral platforms, and we obviously are aware that a world facing inherently global challenges, as evidenced by the COVID-19 pandemic, require globally concerted actions and responses. And the reason why I'm talking about this at such length is because it plays in immediately to South Africa's response in relation to vaccine diplomacy and the Omicron variant and the problems related to that. So I'm now going to move on to the discovery of Omicron and the ping-pong politics that ensued as a result of that. So for those colleagues who don't know the details, on the 25th of November 2021, the National Institute for Communicable Diseases announced that Southern African scientists, and I'm saying Southern African because simultaneously we had the Botswanan based medical virologist, as well as South African and Hong Kong scientists also working on sequencing a new variant around the same time. So I've grouped it around Southern African scientists, discovered a new COVID-19 variant, which was the Omicron variant, different from the dominant Delta variant at the time. And South Africa reported this discovery to the World Health Organization on the 24th of November. So following genome sequencing between the NICD and private labs, 22 positive cases in South Africa had been confirmed at that point. So despite thanking South Africa for its transparency in an apparent knee-jerk reaction, the UK enforced heavy travel restrictions on South Africa at the time, but also on Botswana, Lesotho, Eswatini, Zimbabwe, and Namibia from midday on the 26th of November. The EU and the US followed suit, amongst other countries worldwide. And at the time, President Ramaphosa spoke with the then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson just one day later on the 27th of November, when the Prime Minister promised to work with President Ramaphosa on ways to reopen international travel. In response to the travel restrictions, Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, declared that the international community's reaction to this variant's discovery was a form of punishment for South and Southern Africa. And I wanted to just highlight a quote that Minister Pandor said, which was, whilst we respect the right of all countries to take the necessary precautionary measures to protect their citizens, we need to remember that this pandemic requires collaboration and sharing of expertise. Our immediate concern is the damage that these restrictions are causing to families, the travel and tourism industries, and business, close quote. So the BBC at the time reported that's the British Broadcasting Corporation, reported at the time that DIRCO's response was complaining in relation to the UK's reaction to its discovery of the variant. But DIRCO announced that these scientists should have been applauded for their scientific discovery and transparency and really not seen to be punished or vilified for it. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres also condemned the travel restrictions. And we're also very well aware that South Africa's tourism industry was heavily affected once again as December flights to South Africa dropped by 85%, compared with just a month before in November 2021. So within 2 days of the UK placing South Africa on its red list of no-go countries, the Republic's hospitality sector had lost 1 billion rand in cancelled bookings. So the virologist in Botswana, Dr. Sikulule Moyo, who was one of the virologists who discovered the variants around the same time as those in South Africa and in Hong Kong, contended that the response by some of these countries to this discovery was disproportionate. And again, I like to use his quote. He said, "It was like taking an AK-47 to kill an ant before you understand it." And I thought that was actually quite a telling and really representative quote of the situation, especially since countries around the world had really by November 2021 started to understand more and more about the COVID pandemic. It had been almost 2 years at that point. So the travel restrictions had further implications in that the much needed reagents needed to sequence genomes were usually transported via normal airlines, and now they were being negatively affected, making the surveillance of new variants even more difficult. So in a way, the apparent knee-jerk response, which some people might applaud as other countries simply trying to protect their own citizens and trying to learn from their own previous mistakes, in this case, may have helped contribute to less understanding of the new variant when it could have been understood at a much better or quicker frequency. So the Botswana president at the time also called the travel restrictions on Southern African states irresponsible, and he didn't want to be seen as geopoliticizing the virus, but that is essentially what this became all about at the time. And he did to allude to some of the 4 diplomats who were first tested positive for the variant as having come from Europe, thereby throwing blame back on the so-called punishers that had brought through these travel restrictions. And after South Africa announced the existence of Omicron, other countries also announced it had detected this in their own populations, including Israel, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Czech Republic. So what we wanted to try and emphasize with this was to talk about the ping-pong politics that had come about as a result of the discovery of Omicron, because even though these kind of ping-pong politics might seem to be a natural response to something, or it's just a matter of normal, everyday, realist debate around power politics, this back and forth between actors or agents or organizations or diplomats, whatever it might be, it may seem cursory as a result of that, because this is it's a natural stance within politics, this ping pong politics, but it had more serious consequences for the long-standing debate, and I think this is still true, around global inequalities and the respect due to all countries and their citizens in a global community in relation to scientific discovery and advances, as well as transparency around these discoveries. So President Ramaphosa made reference to this whilst on his December 2021 state visit with the Côte d'Ivoire president, and he said that we need to stand firmly against any form of health apartheid in the fight against this pandemic. And so sustained global cooperation needs to overcome the pandemic. And so we can only do that through science. And I'm just paraphrasing what he'd said there. So his comments related to this ongoing global discussion around the status of vaccine diplomacy in global South countries especially. So now I'll move on to talking about the second area of discussion in the chapter, which is vaccine diplomacy and South Africa's advocacy role at the time. So many colleagues don't really know this, and especially laymen in normal public life, that 15 years ago, South Africa was one of 7 countries that officially linked foreign policy and global health through the Oslo Ministerial Declaration. And emerging from this came the term vaccine diplomacy, which refers to almost any aspect of global health diplomacy that relies on the use or delivery of vaccines. And it refers also to the use of vaccines as well as vaccination efforts as a tool of foreign policy to build and to strengthen relationships between countries. It typically involves a country providing vaccines or vaccine-related aid to other countries in order to improve its global standing or demonstrate leadership, and subsequently gain geopolitical influence as well. So we're looking there at kind of realist and liberal motivations or intentions. But while vaccine diplomacy can be seen as a positive step towards global cooperation and humanitarian efforts, it's also been criticized for being politically motivated and really potentially exacerbating geopolitical tensions. So there's a positive and negative aspect around the use of vaccine diplomacy by states internationally. And additionally, some have argued that vaccine diplomacy efforts may come at the expense of, for example, domestic vaccination efforts in providing countries with vaccines as opposed to providing your own citizens with vaccines. It's also been brought back into foreign policy debates, obviously following the outbreak of COVID-19. But this is really not unsurprising, given that COVID-19 vaccines are a crucially important resource. And one example of vaccine diplomacy that we could refer to very quickly is the COVID-19 Vaccines Global Access, or COVAX program, a global initiative aimed at ensuring equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So it reasons then that the manner in which this resource is shared or potentially withheld by states has great implications for international relations. So in the second year of COVID-19, when vaccines became apparent in the South African circumstances, there were still concerns regarding the supply and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and it being used by various global powers, notably China, the US, India, and Russia, as a diplomatic tool within their respective foreign policy arsenal kits. And for this reason, the outbreak of the virus has had a tremendous impact or effect on the nature of international diplomacy, because states are increasingly looking towards vaccine diplomacy as a kind of strategic form of soft power, which would be able to influence, form and solidify regional and global partnerships, expand their power and boost their global image and status. So on the one hand, then, vaccine diplomacy has a great potential to advance the global public good in a highly unequal world. In such a scenario, states having a surplus of COVID-19 vaccines may in fairness share their surpluses with states who are in need. But on the other hand, states acting in their self-interest may strategically choose with whom and whether to share their additional vaccines. So vaccine diplomacy, therefore, is regarded as controversial and is carefully scrutinized on the basis of ethics, particularly because affordable and non-discriminatory access to vaccines is essentially a human right. So South Africa is also engaged in its fair share of vaccine diplomacy, but unlike some major powers, such as the ones I've just mentioned, South Africa's exercise of vaccine diplomacy under the leadership of Ramaphosa has not really been in the pursuit of self-interest necessarily, but rather in safeguarding the lives and livelihoods of the most vulnerable in South Africa and on the African continent. So in June 2022, in response to the South African government's request for vaccine assistance, the World Bank approved a 7.6 billion rand loan for South Africa's COVID-19 emergency response project. And South Africa welcomed the support at the time, which was intended to assist the government with the procurement of more vaccines and increase the vaccination of its target population to 70%. The World Bank's country director for South Africa had indicated that this support was intended to assist the South African government with its vaccination efforts and ties in with investment and job creation initiatives as laid out in the 2022-2026 World Bank Country Partnership Framework Report. So within the Southern African region, though, there has been less success in terms of lagging behind in facilitating vaccinations for their populations in the SADC community as a regional body. So in our chapter, we have a table which underscores the great disparity between the number of doses secured and those which had actually been received within the SADC region as of the 15th of April 2021. So, for example, I'm sorry I don't have the table here now, but let me just give you an example for Angola. There were over 2,172,000 doses secured, but actually 624,000 received for Covishield, the SII AstraZeneca. Botswana, 180,000, but only 30,000 received. Comores, for example, if I want to bring up a small island state, one of my other interests, 108,000 and only 12,000 received, etc., etc. So while the majority of SADC member states had exploited their bilateral and multilateral partnerships, notably through COVAX, as key suppliers, there was insufficient funds and really poor capacity that stood in the way of member states receiving the much needed vaccines. So when it comes to the South African situation, South Africa displayed really what I'm going to refer to as an altruistic form of vaccine diplomacy, but many of the African countries were unable to administer the vaccines before they expired, and ultimately had to return them or destroy them. So, for example, Malawi had to destroy close to 20,000 AstraZeneca vaccines. South Sudan discarded 59,000 and returned 72,000. So the inability of African countries to use these donated vaccines before they expired arose partly from having insufficient capacity, and that obviously affected the pace of vaccination rollouts. But another factor was vaccine hesitancy, because many of the public did not trust the donated AstraZeneca vaccines, given South Africa's initial concerns that they may cause blood clots. So similar to the situation within the SADC, so too did the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa's economies face difficulties in streamlining their approach to the COVID-19 pandemic and arriving at a well-coordinated and unified South-South response. So, unfortunately, as a member of BRICS, South Africa was initially unable to leverage effectively the group's cooperative response, at least at ministerial level, on COVID-19 vaccines. But nevertheless, lower-level international engagements did take place amongst the BRICS grouping. For example, in 2021, South Africa co-hosted with India a BRICS virtual meeting for the members to share their experiences and responses of the demographic impacts of COVID-19 and their responsive measures, which was a way of these different countries trying to learn from each other and take something from that meeting. By March 2022, though, the launch of the BRICS Vaccine R&D Center initiative created the impression of surer footing of this cooperative grouping. South Africa had suggested the creation of a vaccination center during its BRICS chairship in 2018 prior to the COVID outbreak. And the operationalization of this idea was intended to significantly bolster global capacities to prepare for and respond to pandemics. And it is an example of best practice, really, in international cooperation in international cooperation in science, I beg your pardon, and it will further deepen BRICS partnership, solidarity, and friendship, according to Nzimande, who was quoted at the time. The launch of this centre is an affirmation of South Africa's consistent use of multilateral platforms, that is leveraging its whatever influence it may possess within BRICS, as well as its pursuit of inclusive political dialogue on global issues, which is something that I must indicate has been the case in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in this case, the need to ensure vaccines were a global public good, accessible and affordable to global populations. So South Africa had indicated, I just need to quickly move a little bit ahead because I think I'm running out of time for my section. But South Africa had also indicated its support for the creation of the Financial Intermediary Fund as an instrument to finance global health security as part of a global continental initiative. So President Ramaphosa had alerted the global community to the implementation of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDCs, their enhanced surveillance strategy for community-based testing, wastewater testing, and sentinel surveillance. Additionally, messenger RNA, or the acronym there, mRNA hubs investing in technology transfer opened in South Africa, Egypt, Senegal, Tunisia, Kenya, and Nigeria. But very importantly, President Ramaphosa pleaded with the international community to ensure that solidarity and equity underpinned the next phase in their management of the pandemic. This was in 2022. Then he was saying this, the president. And granted, Ramaphosa's pleading for global solidarity came in the aftermath of the discovery of the Omicron variant, but South African scientists and the ensuing travel ban placed on SADC member states. But the point stands that the travel ban posed on SADC member states had led to this knee-jerk reaction, and from the UK and other countries, and President Ramaphosa publicly and harshly criticized what he referred to as the self-interested style of vaccine diplomacy adopted by Western countries at the time. He did so as a special guest at the 7th International Dakar Forum on Peace and Security, which took place in December 2021. And he took the opportunity to address Western countries. It may have arguably have been one of his finest hours as an advocate for South Africa and Africa within the context of the pandemic. But he did take Western countries to task at the time by addressing their behavior, particularly around the travel ban, noting that South Africa had actually performed in a responsible manner when it announced in a transparent way the discovery of that variant, and the disproportionate response by the northern countries to impose the ban was unfair, and that Western countries, he said, essentially had resorted to their own selfish interests. And so he took the West to task over greed as well in relation to COVID-19 vaccinations, saying that the Western countries had ordered more vaccines than their populations required, and that when we wanted vaccines in the global south, they kept giving us crumbs from their tables, to use his terms. So closely linked to this point is the fact that African states have generally paid more for COVID-19 vaccinations than their Western counterparts. Data from UNICEF has indicated that, and that's in another table. But this self-serving behavior on the part of the West highlights the unethical side of vaccine diplomacy and warrants President Ramaphosa's criticism that the greed they demonstrated is quite disappointing, particularly when they say that they're our partners in the global north, because our lives in Africa are just as important, he said, as their lives in Europe, North America, and in fact, all over. So for this reason, President Ramaphosa, in building solidarity amongst his African counterparts, emphasized that the task facing African nations is to drive the recovery, but that a recovery, he said, was a sustainable, inclusive, leaving nobody behind and no country behind methodology. In particular, he highlighted the need for African-produced vaccines to be procured for Africa's people. Manufacturing vaccines, he said, locally would not just be the safest and fastest way to access life-saving medication, but also critical for important economic recovery, something the South African economy, amongst other economies around the world, faced as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in line with this, the AU had intended to produce 60% of its own vaccinations by the year 2040. But data from May 2022, earlier this year, shows that Africa only produced a very, very poor, disappointing 1% of all vaccines administered on the continent. And in advocating for locally manufactured vaccines, South Africa was part of those, endorsing a common agenda for manufacturing vaccines in Africa, which took place in February this year at the 35th AU Summit. And so just quickly to summarize this section, in Ramaphosa's pursuit of locally manufactured COVID-19 vaccines, South Africa opened up the continent's largest COVID-19 vaccination plant, or vaccine plant, Aspen Pharmacare, in Gqeberha in 2021. Aspen had signed a deal with Johnson & Johnson, who provided them with a drug substance to use in the manufacturing of its own vaccine, Aspenovac. The opening of this plant was considered a game changer for Africa because it was seen as giving the continent control over the availability, allocation, and distribution of doses. So South Africa was determined to play its role in Africa too, and in 2021 signed an agreement with African Vaccination Acquisition Trust, or AVAT, through the African Renaissance Fund, pledging to donate 2 million of its Johnson & Johnson vaccines to African countries. The public had already donated 10 million rand to the Global Fund and intended to contribute more to the Access to COVID-19 Tools, or ACT, accelerator. Ramaphosa had also been a champion for South Africa and Africa through AVAT, and he exercised his particular altruistic brand of vaccine diplomacy to secure vaccines for the continent. And so that was something that we felt had to be emphasized in terms of what our leadership had managed to do for the South African population and African countries. So by April 2022, South Africa's Gqeberha vaccine plant was on the verge of shutting down its production, however, having received no orders from vaccinations from African countries. So fortunately, just to give a kind of update on that, Aspen Pharmacare successfully managed to secure funding totaling $30 million from the Gates Foundation and other bodies in December 2022, which saved them from closure. So the new funding from these different institutions would support a 10-year agreement between Aspen and Serum Institute that aimed to expand the supply and sourcing of affordable vaccines and manufacturing in Africa, which was, after all, the whole reason behind President Ramaphosa's idea that vaccinations should be produced, his and other African countries' ideas that vaccines should be produced in countries that need it the most, and especially amongst the world's poorest people who desperately need it. So then if we can move on then to the next slide, where we talk about South Africa's global economic engagement. Here we talk about how COVID really caused disruptions to global supply chains, which we are, I think most of us are aware. It impacted South Africa's exports and imports quite drastically. But in January 2022, SARS had released trade statistics for South Africa for the previous month, December 2021, and announced a preliminary trade balance surplus recorded of 30.14 billion, including trade conducted between South Africa and its immediate neighbors of Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, and Namibia. Trade statistics for the 2021 reporting year indicated an improvement in the trade balance from 271 billion in 2020 to 440 billion in 2021. Over this time frame, imports increased by 34.2% and exports increased by 22.9%. In an updated 2022 Global Trade Report published by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, South Africa's trade growth was evident in the first quarter of 2022. Trade in goods for both imports up by 19% relative to 2019, and exports up to 46% relative to 2019. So well above the pre-pandemic levels of 2019. So for that period, export growth remained strong for South Africa. But in summary of this section, which a colleague of mine actually wrote about, the country's manufacturing sector was affected. Factories we know closed or operated at reduced capacity due to severe lockdowns and restrictions and everybody having to basically be in their home spaces. The pandemic also led to decreased demand for many of South Africa's exports, including commodities like gold, platinum, and coal, and a reduction in foreign direct investment in South Africa, because investors became more risk averse and focused on protecting their own existing investments. The country's mining and energy sectors have been particularly affected by reduced investment. And then if we move on to the second slide, the pandemic caused a global economic recession, as we all know. That did have an impact on South Africa's economy. In response, the South African government's implemented a range of measures to try and mitigate this, including stimulus packages, loan guarantees, tax relief, funds for people. However, the effectiveness of these measures had been limited by high levels of corruption and mismanagement, making them less significant, less effective. Some good news, however, when the drive by President Ramaphosa received overall approval from multiple investors, South Africa's trade growth was evident, as I mentioned already, in the first quarter, and as stipulated by UNCTAD. We can move on now to the next slide.
Okay, so if I could come in here now, Susie, thanks. So I know that we're running out of time now, so I'll try and be quite brief, but these are important slides, and I do think I need to pay some attention to them. This is around some lessons learned and some recommendations around what we've discovered in our exploration of the topics in this chapter. So the first one here was around this notion of South Africa continuing to make effective use of its international relations. This we found to be very true. There was a greater shift, as we said before, towards the emphasis on vaccine diplomacy emerging, and of course, what President Ramaphosa's role was in that whole emergence of vaccine diplomacy at the time. A lesson learned, but also something to be continued in the future, especially if we refer back to the argument of future pandemics coming our way. But we also found that international politics is all about perception, highlighted in capital letters and orange bold there for you, because it really is about that. So it's about how you're perceived as well across the world, and not necessarily always about what you actually do, but how you're perceived in what you do and how you do it. So we say here that South Africa should continue to play a leadership role in Africa and the global South, despite this idea of the pandemic-related challenges that existed in the last 2 years. And we still are, of course, feeling the effects of that and implications of that still. And I give a few examples, but I'm not going to go into that here because we sort of need to get to a discussion, I think. But the next point really is around South Africa must persist in its advocacy for greater inclusivity in bilateral and multilateral platforms around vaccine access and production going forward. This, of course, links to this whole argument that Susie mentioned before around health apartheid and what Ramaphosa said about that. And so we think because South Africa created such a name for itself under the president during the height of the COVID pandemic, and the way that he advocated for South Africa and Africa, that this is an essential area for South Africa that we could actually lead in going forward. And so it must be emphasized as a lesson learned and a recommendation going forward. Okay, more lessons learned. So the North-South disparities that Susie referred to before and obvious unequal power structures in global health clearly remain a challenge for all of us in international politics. It raises a question, though, of course, about how do we confront this unequal system going forward? And not really, obviously, our focus is on COVID-19 and what has happened during the pandemic, but this question is essentially relevant across all aspects of international and national domestic politics. How do you change the unequal system going forward? And what regulatory frameworks would we need to change? How would we need to change the international system itself? Does that mean that we need to make changes to the UN system and a member of Africa being in the permanent five? Those kinds of arguments would be necessary going forward. The changing nature of the rules of the game is obviously an important one for us as well. How do we balance interests and needs? And also an important argument, who decides the rules of the game and how do we access that power so that we're at the table? So we're not the people who are, as Suzanne referred to before, feeding off the crumbs that fall off the table. How do we become those members who are cutting the cake and not feeding off the crumbs, basically, in essence? So how do we buy into this changing nature of the rules of the game, and how do we balance these interests and needs going forward? We learned some lessons from COVID, and we were able to demonstrate our power in some way, even if it might have been symbolic in some instances, but nevertheless it was there for South Africa. So there is room for improvement going forward, but we cannot underestimate that we did have some power at the time and some impact. And I think we should be commended for that and for what we achieved at the time. Another lesson learned was around the president clearly communicating to domestic and global audiences really South Africa's position and status on the pandemic itself, but also importantly vaccine access in the second year of COVID. And I think I should highlight here, and I really should have actually highlighted the word transparency because this is really important. Transparency and effective communication assists in mitigating risks, not just for pandemics, but for all other humanitarian and global crises. And these are absolutely important domestic and diplomatic tools. South Africa was good, or it did perform well in terms of transparency and effective communication. And so I think we continue to learn from the lessons of the past and to carry on doing what we did well during that pandemic, or the height of that pandemic. But an important point here is, of course, also consistency in approach and position is very important. Consistency in international cooperation is important for a number of reasons, and I wanted to highlight these because of South Africa's potential role that it could play going forward in terms of building strong relationships and increasing trust, obviously in the Global South, obviously in the AU, obviously in BRICS, because that's an important partnership body for us, but also across the globe. If we can increase our consistency in our approach to something, and we can ensure that our position is consistent in how we approach something, then it means that we can address challenges more effectively going forward. We can achieve more, obviously, when we work together than when we do alone. So there are a number of reasons why this would be important, but another example could be sharing resources and expertise. It's an obvious one. Maybe not duplicating efforts, avoid duplication of efforts if we can share information with each other, improving coordination with each other, strengthening international institutions essentially at the core of what they are. But at the heart of all of this really is consistency and positionality, which we think is important. Another point, just to emphasize the point about transparency, we were transparent in how we communicated the discovery around the science of Omicron, and we alerted the necessary world bodies very timeously. So this was an important lesson for us to learn, but it also kind of links back to the point I was making before around the changing nature of the rules of the game and balancing interests and needs, because it was a way for South Africa to contribute to the rule-based system because we demonstrated this immediate response by communicating immediately about what we had discovered. And this was important. It showed that South Africa actually walked the talk in terms of its foreign policy, upholding its foreign policy. And obviously the recommendation is to continue in this fashion. I say this with some trepidation, because of course there are issues that are not linked to this chapter around, the International Criminal Court and what that means if Putin comes to South Africa and upholding rules-based systems, etc. So this actually opens up a can of worms in terms of discussing international politics more generally. But if we're sticking to this topic around COVID, South Africa did play a role in this rule-based system, and it did show that it was committed to upholding international rules and laws around the COVID pandemic. And this was an important lesson for us and something that we should adhere to. I think, at least if we're going to continue in this discussion around pandemics and the sharing of information timeously. Other lessons learned. The pandemic obviously exacerbated South Africa's economic challenges, which we already had, obviously many of. Poverty, unemployment, and inequality. I don't think that I'll go into that because it's sort of an obvious lesson that was learned. It's just, I suppose, an important one to reiterate or emphasize. But perhaps to say that the next point around tourism is almost one of the most important ones on the slide, actually, because our discovery here just re-emphasized the point that tourism is a huge soft power tool for South Africa as a state. Obviously, there was a struggle when COVID happened, when it first happened initially. Then there was optimism again, and then there was further struggle after Omicron because that dealt a massive blow. And Susie talked about the money lost and the billions lost in a 2-day period with the discovery of Omicron and the travel ban, etc. So that all just emphasized reinforced the point that tourism is a huge soft power tool in the South African context, and we must cultivate that and really just grow that more and more. Another important point, South Africa obviously continues to work with global formal and informal bodies as well, because we can't neglect the civil society organizations. It's just that it's not as important necessarily a topic in international politics necessarily as it is in domestic politics. But nevertheless, it's still true. To dispel vaccine myths, because this was another important point that I don't think Susie necessarily spoke about now in the presentation, but is in the chapter around the harm that vaccine myths actually generated, and how to dispel those myths in a way that's coordinated in an effort amongst groups and countries so that you can share information and that information is truthful and it's not what we would refer to as fake news, which is the phrase that one hears bandied about these days. But that's a very important point. And linked to that is this idea of African youth being harnessed in a more important way, because the African youth, as we know, the youth make up the majority of the African continent, and that's the way it's going to be for the next however many years going into the forward, decades into the future. And we are not harnessing African youth the way that we should have done, or we haven't at all harnessed the African youth the way that we should have done, especially in terms of the impact that they have with social media networks and campaigns that they create, and the energy and creativity that the young people have could have played a much more vital role in dispelling vaccine myths in the first place and sharing truthful information around vaccines, which could have helped in the South African context and across, really actually across the global South, but our focus is on Africa, of course, here. But that's an important point. So emphasize this idea of harnessing the voice of the youth. Another point, COVID-19 pandemic, what it revealed was state solidarity and support for each other is extremely important. I think that point really speaks for itself, actually, so I won't go into it. But another important point, really, to continue to monitor South Africa's foreign policy principles in action. This is really essential, actually, because oh, sorry, my screen just disappeared for a second. It's back. So continue to monitor South Africa's foreign policy principles in action, especially in regional and continental bodies. And Susie mentioned this point about multilateralism being important, and really since '94 in South Africa's foreign policy toolbook or toolkit, if you want to say it that way. And this is a continuation of that initial principle. So how do we promote multilateralism going forward? Bilateralism is of course important, but we're focusing here on the multilateral principles, because promoting peace and promoting international responses to pandemics and integration to responses in pandemics is obviously going to play out more in a multilateral platform. And I think that is definitely going to be the case going forward with future pandemics. So this is key, a key lesson and recommendation. And so, yeah, so I'll end with that then and say thank you. There was more we could have discussed, but I think we're definitely over time. So I want to apologize to Anita for that. But then I think we still have some time for some questions and for discussion. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for listening to us speed through that presentation to fit in as much information as possible.
Thank you to the professors, Graham, both Susie and Victoria. Thank you so much. And there is a lot of information there. This is now the time for discussion. I just want to start with one question to either of you. Obviously, this unequal power system was very evident in the both in vaccine and the Omicron disaster. But could you tell us, did the fact that our research was such world class, did that not place us in one or another way on the world map of medical research? To what extent do you think that the research produced by the South African epidemiologist mainly was known, or did this whole pandemic help to place them on the world map?
Mm. Thanks so much, Marie, for that question. So Vicky, before you come in, I think I can say, Marie, that South African scientists, look, South African science is not my speciality, but I am aware that scientists have actually in the South African space been lauded for a number of years prior to COVID-19, because they've been working in international partnerships with other countries on other related matters in relation to malaria in the continent and Ebola outbreaks, etc., etc. But I think that you're right in your assessment that COVID-19 actually did put South African scientists on the map. And that was the paradox, because in terms of science diplomacy, it was a wonderful thing for South Africa, for our scientists, to be recognized for what they were able to contribute, for the pace at which they were discovering things, but also through their collaboration and solidarity, their efforts to share and to be transparent. So I think the paradox I'm talking about is why President Ramaphosa responded in such an immediate way to that knee-jerk reaction as a result of a discovery that was helped to be brought to the world's attention through, in part, South African scientists, why the knee-jerk reaction was one of punishing and vilifying when it should have been of applauding. Because was it simply a natural response that because something emerged from an African space, it should be seen as negative and, you know, just something to be looked down upon, or what was that response? Or if it had been discovered in America, for example, would there have been a different response to it? So, and we will never know that now, because this is how history is played out. But I think you're absolutely right that in science diplomacy terms, South African scientists were put on the map, but they were recognized. And then unfortunately, because of the Omicron discovery, vilified at one point because of how they helped to bring this to the world's attention. But I think what it has done is given South African scientists an opportunity domestically to be encouraged by what they can do and the reach they can have globally, and just how, you know, we shouldn't be looked down upon as a country, for example, in terms of international relations, how science and international relations can join together. So we could almost use it not just in a I'm talking too much, Marie, but we could almost use it not just in a soft power way, like, you know, our scientists lead, so we can start to draw attention to ourselves and attract people in terms of trusting us and what we have to say as a country. But then I go against that straight away by the failure of our energy system. So I don't know. I guess everything balances out at the end of the day. I don't know, Vicky, if you want to add anything.
I just wanted to add, you kind of said what I was going to say, but actually this is another point that I don't think we cover this in this chapter, but I know that other colleagues talk about this in other chapters in the book, and also read several articles about this, is what the South African scientists did in terms of prompting what they refer to as intensified genomic surveillance efforts worldwide, and the contribution to science in that way. And so it's not just the science though, but also in terms of public policy making and policy responses in the public health sector, how South Africa has been looked to in that capacity also. So I think we shouldn't just be confident in what South African scientists managed to do at that level of the genome, but also in terms of public health policy and what that means to, globally. So I just wanted to come in there because obviously I'm a South African political scientist as opposed to an IR practitioner. So Susie is. So I wanted to make sure that we emphasize the importance too of the domestic political science aspect of this and public policy making, which is quite important.
Thank you. Thank you for that thorough response. I see a hand. Elaine Venter.
Afternoon. Thanks. It was really very interesting. Just a quick question. I'm from GTAC. Did I understand you correctly that, did you say that the demand from Africa for our vaccines were quite low or is quite low? Countries on the continent, their interest and demand, maybe if yes, why would you say that is?
Sue? Did Susie just drop off?
No, she just needs to unmute.
Oh.
Sorry, Marie. You'd think by now I would know how to unmute after 2 years of muting. But Elaine, yes, so thank you so much for your question. I think that was the weird thing we also identified, because you would think that having a local base of vaccine production, like in a South African space, would be something of massive benefit to the continent because of easier access, because of better negotiated deals with South African counterparts, just being able to get vaccines to places in the correct time, etc. But it is true that we discovered that there was less and less countries invested in vaccines produced by South Africa or shared by South Africa. One of the reasons was a mistrust in a certain type of vaccine, AstraZeneca, like I said, and possibility of blood clots. So it was about the mistrust in vaccines coming out of South Africa, but it was also about inability, unfortunately, in those states themselves to manage adequately and quickly enough the dispersal, the layout of vaccines, the management of keeping the vaccines cold at a certain temperature, whatever it was. So it was about capacity, infrastructure, and mistrust. Those three things, sorry, Vicky, those three things that had an impact. And then because of the lack of interest, it led to the Quebeca plant basically facing a very quick death. And so it was only because of the sudden injection of funds from the Gates Foundation and other bodies that it was able to revive itself. So I think that was such a strange finding that we were able to reflect on, and maybe we could have reflected on that a little bit more, but it is part of the chapter. Sorry, Vicky.
Yeah. I was just going to add to, because you actually also said what I was going to say again, but also this idea of vaccine hesitancy generally, and about uptake of vaccines generally. So I don't even know if it would necessarily been about South Africa. It would have been for any uptake of vaccines. And so general vaccine hesitancy. Susie made the point about the capacity issue or the capability issue. So limited infrastructure in the healthcare area was another reason. And then I think the logistical constraints that you mentioned before as well, Susie, in trying to administer vaccines timeously and before that they became unviable was a key thing for us that we found out. So yeah, so those, I just wanted to add those really to that.
Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat. Any hands, any discussion? I see there's some other authors also in this meeting. Any additional contributions from you, from other chapter teams? There's obviously a lot of overlap with some of the other groups of researchers that we have as part of the COVID-19 country report, chapter 2 and chapter 3, as I mentioned, and of course the health chapter, which is under the leadership of Professor Mosa Moshabala, and also the chapter on the impact of vulnerable groups. And very important in this regard, in the international relations, is the is the communication chapter. So we'll try to host more of these Friday webinars around discussing the other areas, all of which is obviously intertwined around this whole one issue of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Maybe I can add one thing. I'm Bernd Rosenkranz, and I'm the convener of Chapter 2 on Leadership and Governance. And we are looking actually in our chapter, and we had made the presentation as Marie had indicated already before. We are looking into the issue of disaster risk management. And obviously that is a major topic for South Africa, to be prepared also for other disasters. And certainly also on the international side, it was very important then to closely work together. So I would like to emphasize from our side that is very much in line with what you are saying. I think, with some of our interviews, we have seen actually also on the continent with people from Uganda or from Rwanda, who had indicated that there is confirmed the need of working more closely together. And can you say anything more around now the issue, not only on COVID-19 or pandemic, but other disasters, and the possibility actually to improve the situation on the continent by working together with other countries?
Yes, so thank you so much, Prof. It's such an important point, isn't it? And I think that what this has done for the South African space is, because we're lucky enough to have, well, some people might say unlucky, but I think in some respects very lucky to have a consistent government in place since 1994. We have a main governing party in power since 1994. So even though I'm not conflating party and state, what we can say is that there's been generally consistency in terms of position, motivation, ideas surrounding the development of science and technology, the development of public health systems, the development of education for all people across the country, and all of these similar types of things that have been consistently growing since 1994. So in a way, the COVID-19 pandemic was a really good test for us as a country to solidify that in international platforms even more. And even though South Africa has played quite a substantial role on the continent in various platforms since 1994, in the AU, in SADC, in other, across the Pan-African Parliament, all of these different types of international bodies, what the pandemic did for us was allow us to bring together in a kind of intersectional way different expertise and showcase South Africa as, in a way, somebody that could be regarded as a trustworthy, valid leader in exercising some kind of coordination and cooperation. So as you were suggesting, Prof, going forward, what South Africa should be able to do is harness what it's been able to attract towards itself, which is this idea that it can lead, it can offer support, it can initiate grand ideas, it can attract attention, it can have a vocal opinion that is actually listened to across the globe. It can do all these things and it can do them effectively. But it can't do them effectively if across Africa, for example, there is inability or a lack of capacity or no buy-in in terms of the partners that you have. So, you're only as effective as the group or team you're working with. As a leader, you're only as effective as the team you're working with. So if South Africa wants to be a leader going forward, it certainly, in my view, can do so, and it's got experience to prove it can do so. But it also has limitations that drag its reputation down a little bit in other areas, which is a problem. And I think that's why Vicky was talking about consistency before. As long as there's consistent approach in how to reduce risk or how to approach risk across the continent, then it could still be looked to as somebody that could lead and assist in bringing people together and helping to elevate cooperation, because you need somebody to chivvy people along, to make things happen, to actually set up the meetings, to set up the trans-border and scientific skills flow, those kinds of things. And I think South Africa is actually good at doing that. And many countries across Africa believe South Africa is good at that. So as long as they keep believing that, then South Africa can do a lot to coordinate cooperation going forward. Okay, sorry, Vicky.
Yeah, sorry, Susie, if I could come in and just say also again, because my political science part of my brain is kicking in, and I just wanted to emphasize too, that although the international relations is obviously very important, there can also be international relations that is not at state level as well. So South Africa also has quite a lot of power in terms of at below the state, or at levels below the state in terms of civil society and multi-agency coordination across Southern Africa and really across the whole continent. But it could potentially be more important elsewhere too. But I think that if we bring in the idea of NGOs here and community-based organizations and agencies that might not necessarily be government focused, although they might be a stakeholder, and that's obviously important too. But I think we can't neglect the importance that South Africa has in terms of playing a role in the private sector or in the civil society sector as well in the global south and across Southern Africa. Just because I know of very many projects that go on at local level, and where there's sharing of knowledge at local level, it might not necessarily have the state involvement or government involvement. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there to make sure we keep some political science as well.
Thank you. Can I ask the colleagues that's still on the call to, before I close, just in the chat box, write what other themes around the COVID pandemic they would like to listen to, because I know our Friday webinars are popular amongst the same group of people, quite a lot of government officials. And it would be great if you could give us an indication, because we have so many themes that we have investigated and appointed scientists and researchers from across South Africa to work on. And it would be helpful for us to know which of those themes you would like to hear more about, now that we have coming to the close of the second edition country report. So any ideas, any guidance there will be helpful. From my side, while we're waiting for those responses, thanks to both profs from political science and UJ and from Turkey's. And thank you for the year, or is it 18 months of work? It was great working with you and your team. And we're looking forward to the editing process and the finalization process in the launch later in this year of the second edition report. So thank you so much from GTAC and DPME side for your contribution.
Thank you.
So Anita, I can close with that.
Yes, thanks, Marie. I think what I will also do is I will send out just like a survey for the topics, just so that and then I'll get back to you. But thank you so much. I'm just going to share the survey quickly. Colleagues, please take a moment and fill it out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.